All right. Good evening. This is Mac Bolan, owner and operator of Lock and Load Productions, LLC. Tonight I want to do, because it's been in the news recently about the U.S. recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and deciding to move their embassy, and of course the whole outrage involved in it. Of course, this, relatively speaking, this is something that should have happened many, many years ago, and I'm going to go over the whole thing because there's a lot of emotion, a lot of ignorance involved when it comes to the issue involving Israel and the Palestinians. So let me go through this. Right off the bat, there is never, ever, ever in the history of the world, ever been a kingdom of Palestine, a state of Palestine, ever. There have been numerous kingdoms of Israel. And if you go back to biblical times, when Israel was invaded and the people were taken out and brought to Egypt as slaves and then led out of bondage by Moses, eventually led into the promised land by Joshua, Israel became a kingdom. Jerusalem has been an Israeli holy city for many, many years, predating any of the Arabs. And make no mistake, Palestine is a territory. Palestinians are Arabs, and quite frankly, they didn't even begin calling themselves Palestinians until the late 40s. And the original people who lived in the territory of Palestine weren't even Arabs back then. So you can go through history, and the area was conquered by Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, then later Persia and Darius, Alexander the Great, Rome. Even during that time when Rome had conquered the Middle East and Israel, the Hebrews back then were allowed to self-govern. Still no Arabs. Okay, then fast forward to the time of Muhammad and the Muslim invasions that conquered the territories, spread through the Middle East, North Africa. And again, this was conquered territory. People were basically given a choice to either convert or be slain. Numerous peoples, if you go across the North Africa, like the Eritreans, Berbers, etc., were all subverted. All these areas were occupied and conquered. So if you want to talk about the original illegal occupation, let's talk about the conquest and occupation of the North Africa, Middle East, Asia, attempted into Europe, and then the many years in Eastern Europe. And it goes on. And, you know, you hear people bash the Crusades, yet if you look at why the Crusades were formed, they were formed to go and fight the occupation of the Holy Land by the Muslims. And the first crusade actually succeeded. And Jerusalem was an open city. And during the time frame, people were allowed to come and go. Arab, Hebrews, Christians, etc. There was no problem. Then later on came a subsequent invasion by the Saracens under Salah ad-Din, and he took Jerusalem back. There was a subsequent crusade that failed, but there was a peace that was established between Richard of England and Salah ad-Din. Anyway, the area had always been in a lot of tension. Then, of course, came the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks were an extremely brutal empire. In 1916, there was an Arab rebellion against the Turks. And subsequently, during World War I, United Kingdom occupied the area. At the same time, you know, speaking of the Turks, They were actually the people responsible for the very first modern genocide, which involved the Armenians, also around the time frame of 1916 and World War I. So you could go to the time frame that passed. Now, in 1936, there was another revolution, and they formed the Peel Commission, which tried to work towards a two-state solution, which, of course, the Arabs never, ever agreed to and never wanted. 1947, you had another war, invasion. 1949, it was Jordanian occupation. Then if you go towards 1948, commission was formed by the UN. And let's keep in mind, the United Nations originally was formed because of the Nazis under Hitler and under the phrase never again, which referred to the Holocaust, which involved millions of Jews and millions of Slavs. And at one point, they were going to form a separate nation of Israel. And UN Resolution 186 was never passed because of all the Arab objection to it. And eventually, in 1948, Israel just went ahead and declared their independence. Now, you'll hear a lot of argument and half-truths by people who are complete idiots who say Israel was basically founded by immigrating European Jews, and that's a half-truth because a lot of Jews did come from Europe, but a lot of Jews that were scattered across Africa and the rest of the Middle East also came back to Israel. And during the time frame, there was a immediate invasion by 5 different Arab countries. Now, the Arab-Israeli war lasted about a year, 2 years. During that time frame, Israel lost 1/3 of their population. The invading armies being, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. They lost. Israel became a nation, but again, there was partial control of Jerusalem at the time. Fast forward to 1967. Another attempted invasion. This time, the Israelis launched a preemptive strike, and this became the infamous Six-Day War. And again, the Arab nations were defeated. It started out with attacks in Egypt. Syria got involved. Jordan was involved. Now, during this time frame, after the Six-Day War, the Arab League got together and made their declaration known as the 3 No's. No recognition of Israel, no negotiation, no peace. Important to note, Israel really, at this point, they had no choice. 1973, Yom Kippur War, a surprise attack launched simultaneously by Egypt and Syria. Now, in this case, they caught Israel completely by surprise. It was almost a titanic disaster. At one point, the Syrians had overrun completely the Golan Heights and wiped out practically an entire regiment of Israeli troops. And an interesting note, now during this time frame, Gamal Nasser was the president of Egypt. He had a very strong relationship with the Soviet Union. Both Egypt and Syria had been equipped with modern tanks, T-62 tanks, by the Russians. All their modern MiG aircraft. They were sporting RPG-7s. And the T-62 tanks actually had night fighting capability with IR lights. Israel was still using, white searchlights. The Sagar missile, which was an anti-tank weapon. So both these armies were well equipped and well prepared. Fortunately, they were held off long enough during the invasion. Israel was able to call up their reserves. They were able to bring up a brigade. Syria eventually was pushed back. Egypt was pushed back. And in the counterattacks, and Jordan, unfortunately, reluctantly got involved, lost the entire West Bank in the process. Both Egypt and Syria were pushed way back. Israeli armies were marching deep into Syrian territory. They'd crossed into Egypt. At this point in the 19th century, this is actually the second time, the first being the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union literally came close to conflict. The Russians were supporting and resupplying Syria and Egypt, and the U.S., of course, was supplying Israel, and the tensions got extremely hot. Fortunately, it never went that way. The war ended, but in this particular case, Syria and Egypt both had to give up a lot. Now, eventually, Egypt actually formed a treaty with Israel and were subsequently thrown out of the Arab League. And Jordan also made a peace with Israel, and they were thrown out of the Arab League. Now, after the Yom Kippur War, there was a huge, basically, you could go all the way back to 1948, but there was a huge Palestinian refugee crisis created by the displacement of the Palestinians, who, again, ethnically, they're Arabs. They began calling themselves Palestinians, but they're not a different ethnicity like, say, the Kurds, etc. They're Arabs. And they had moved into Jordan. Now, in 1979, between 1973 and 1979, a lot of tensions grew between the Palestinian refugee camps and the Jordanians, and eventually erupted into open conflict. And in 1979, it's known as Black September, where the Jordanian army fought, shelled, and drove out the PLO. Eventually, they ended up in Beirut in Lebanon, and that led to a ton of problems in Beirut and Lebanon. Go down the road, of course, you had the fighting in Beirut and eventually an invasion by Israel and occupation. You had the two refugee camps of the PLO in Shatila and Burj Barajne. Now, I happen to be in Beirut in 1986. And the interesting thing is, while a lot of people give Israel a bad rap on this, the actual people who were attacking in the beginning, the refugee camps, were the Arab factions in West Beirut. The Amal, the Druze, they were the ones fighting them. Now, eventually, the massacres were perpetrated by the Christian militia, the Phalange, who were also, in conflict. And, the whole Beirut and the civil war in Lebanon is a whole different issue, because they were also involved. Syria occupied Lebanon. You had the rise of Hezbollah, Syrian and Iranian backed. So fast forward now to the year 2000. Barack was the PM of Israel. Arafat still in charge of the PLO. Bill Clinton tries to broker a deal. And for basically 2 weeks, 14 days, Arafat literally said no to everything. An offer of a separate state. Over and over again, they tried to negotiate. Nothing. And shortly after that, the Arabs launched the Palestinians and the Arabs launched a massive wave of suicide attacks, causing approximately 1,000 casualties. Again, nothing solved. A ton of conflicts, terrorist attacks, terrorist incidents. Go to 2008. Peace deal brokered in 2008, which Israel agreed to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and turned over control of the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Now, in Gaza, they made a special deal. Israel removed all their settlements, all their citizens, and pulled out completely from Gaza. Gaza was turned over to 100% Arab control, Arab government. They were allowed to cross back and forth freely. They were allowed free trade. Both the U.S. and Egypt and several other countries poured millions of dollars of support into Gaza. And what happened? Hamas happened. Immediately, they started smuggling in weapons, explosives. They started building tunnels. They put command centers and weapons caches in mosques, in hospitals, in schools. And then at a certain point, they started launching rockets into Israel, totally unprovoked. And keep in mind, if you know the truth about the situation, basically they were given free rein until they started to attack. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They will never recognize Israel, and their only goal is the destruction of Israel. So eventually, the Israelis retaliated, started a blockade, stopped ships. They confiscated tons of arms that were attempted to come in. They found tunnels, and even the UN, which came in to inspect the area, basically, accused Hamas of doing exactly, which pretty much everybody knows by now, what they were doing, and were totally responsible for the renewed fighting. Now, one of the big sticking points that has always been a sticking point regarding peace and a two-state solution is East Jerusalem. Well, East Jerusalem, while the Arabs may claim they want East Jerusalem, or East Jerusalem has to be a capital if they have a second state, is predominantly populated by Israelis, by Jews, and one of the most sacred sites in Judaism, the Wailing Wall, is in East Jerusalem. The bottom line is Israel is never, ever going to give up East Jerusalem to Arab control. Never, ever. Now, they talk about refugees, diversity. You're talking about, again, the question about Jews and Arabs. You could talk about the population. But the biggest sticking point, the two biggest sticking points are, one, you have literally tons of states that are Muslim states. You have literally a sea of Muslim countries, and yet they have an issue with a single Jewish state about the size of New Jersey existing. Secondly, the biggest elephant in the room that nobody ever wants to discuss, and if you really look at it, because they complain every time, Israel Muslims conquered all of this territory, North Africa, Middle East, etc., occupied. Nobody ever talks about that occupation. Israel, in the course of several wars defending their territory, gained the Golan Heights, gained the entire West Bank, and yet everybody has an issue with them taking and occupying that territory. And remember, Jordan lost the West Bank to Israel, lost it. So my point is, what's the issue? Only a hypocrite couldn't see the difference, between the two, or you couldn't see the situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 900-pound gorilla in the room that nobody ever talks about, because they talk about a two-state solution. A two-state solution already exists. The second state is called Jordan. The largest population of Palestinians in the world resides in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Not in Israel, in Jordan. The largest Palestinian population in the world is in Jordan. So, why is there no pressure on Jordan from the rest of the Arab world to create a Palestinian state out of Jordan? Why? Why not? That's where most of them live. Politics. The fact that the Arab world simply cannot tolerate the existence of the state of Israel. And they never will. And there never will be a negotiated peace. And quite frankly, I don't think there ever will be a separate state of Palestine. And quite frankly, I don't care. There are tons of Arabs living in Israel that are citizens, that have become citizens, that serve in the army. When I was over in Israel and working with the recon company of the Golani Brigade, their company commander, Captain Amir, was an Arab in the Israeli army and a citizen. The problem is there is no acceptance on one side of the other side. And quite frankly, I don't think there ever will be. And if I was Israel, I would continue to push settlements in the West Bank. I would continue to take over that territory and force a solution. Now, I'm not a big Trump fan, but his move of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem should have happened years ago. I think it was great. I think it was the right thing to do. And immediately, if you saw the backlash in the UN, it points out to the great hypocrisy in the United Nations, a country, an organization that is in our country that we support with millions and millions of dollars, and yet it serves to bash the U.S., bash Israel. And again, I say the great irony is when the UN was originally formed at the end of World War II, it was in response to Nazi war crimes, the Holocaust, and everything else. And it eventually became an Israeli bashing organization. Now that is irony at its finest. And what just amazes me about the UN, because of this, they've been completely ineffective in Yugoslavia during the war there and in Bosnia. They failed in Iraq. I mean, it's basically an organization that when it comes to peacekeeping, it's more notable for its failures than it is for what it's ever done. And please, let's not forget the genocide in Rwanda, where they had troops on the ground and completely failed to stop that. So anybody who thinks that globalization or the UN or whatever has the right answer, particularly like concerning the question of Israel and Palestine, you're a fucking idiot. You know, I'm sorry, I hate to say that, but you are. You're a fucking idiot. You're ignoring history, and you have no clue. You'll constantly hear people say human rights violations, etc. If you look at the whole picture, the bottom line is you're talking about a single Jewish state the size of New Jersey, simply trying to exist amongst a sea of Arabs that literally want to see them destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. That's it in a nutshell. I mean, that's the way it is. Imagine if we lived here in the U.S. and we were about half the size we are, and both Canada and Mexico were hostile, and we had to deal with the country of Israel deals with. And another irony is there's several organizations within the U.S., like the Jewish American Voice for Peace, that are anti-Israeli. And there are a ton of American liberal Jews who continually blame Israel for anything that happens. So, and they're fucking idiots too. But basically, if you really have to, if you want to understand the entire situation, you have to understand history, and you have to go back and look at history. And I will reiterate again, there was never, ever a free state of Palestine. There were never, ever any Palestinian Arabs back in the day. There were several kingdoms of Israel. And if you want to go back far enough, that's whose land it was originally. That's whose land it should be now. Period. End of story. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and shut the broadcast down now. In about another week or two, I'm going to do another one of these, and I'm going to cover immigration, particularly illegal immigration here in the U.S. I'm not going to pull any punches, just like I didn't on this one. Obviously, you probably can guess where my point of view is on this, but again, I'm going to attack it with facts and plenty of sources. And again, this is Mac Boland of Lock and Load Productions. Have a good night.